So in counting all the express powers of the U.S. Constitution, it turns out we have less than 10 expressed powers that the federal government has. But because of the General Welfare Clause, the Commerce Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause, Equal Protection Clause, they've been able to expand it to a point where basically they can do whatever they feel like, okay? And that's and the supremacy clause, right? So if they pass a law, states pass a law, well, we say we're supreme, so therefore we're supreme. Anybody can throw a supremacy clause in any constitution, and in fact, actually, it's incredible because the federal government, I see only about 10 expressed rights, right? Print money, provide an army, establish post office, those types of things. There's less than 10 expressed rights, but whenever I remember the charter rights in Cincinnati, pretty much completely changed the game. They had got in there. They had completely changed the charter that was written for Cincinnati, which totally changed the way the government had operated. But they had, whenever you develop a charter, like I've read lots of different charters, and whenever you develop a charter, you say that this charter says that you have the rights to everything, right? Anything that's going on, the property, the taxes, the rights of the water and the internet and the sewage, it all falls under the power of the state or the power of the city. So Cincinnati, if they, the charter rights, I don't know the specific one, but if we use that for a hypothetical, Cincinnati could say, well, this charter says that the city of Cincinnati owns all the rights of the public utilities, public services, public, roads and electric poles and whatever. So the state governments and the state constitutions and city constitutions, their charters are saying right from the top, we control everything. We are totalitarian. We get to control everything. Whereas the federal government is very limited in their scope. And so it's interesting because that means a lot of people have a lot of the arguments are right, okay? Maybe even about Obamacare, right? That is not an enumerated power of the federal government, and but we're at war right now, so he's allowed to write these executive orders that was put forth by George Bush, and since he was a war president, we're still at war on terrorism right now. Obama has the powers of a war president, which in terms of Nixon means he can do as he pleases whenever he pleases, no matter what. But if we weren't at war, he only has less than 10 expressed rights in which he can actually, you can use whatever means in order to get these ends of printing money to conduct foreign policy, make treaties, regulate interstate trade. You can use whatever means in order to get to those ends, but those are the only ends that you're allowed to have. So to establish a post office, the federal government is allowed to use guns in order to establish a post office in some town if they wanted to, if that's what they needed to do. But in terms of establishing anything else, they're not allowed to do that. They also sort of regulate the how states treat each other too. So each state has to recognize its public documents and its works and the privileges and immunities, and deliver fugitives from justice to the state having jurisdiction of the crime. Now that kind of reminds me a lot of the Fugitive Slave Act, and there is a Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, but it's been rendered null and void by the 13th Amendment, which illegalizes slavery. You're not allowed to have slavery unless they have been revoked by due process. So if you're able to send somebody into prison, then you're allowed to re-slave them, hence the new Jim Crow. Okay? So let's actually get my sheet. Let's run through this. There's the state powers says that the 10th Amendment says the power is not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states or reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So therefore only those 10 expressed rights, right, to provide for an army and navy, establish post office, to make treaties, conduct foreign policy, to regulate interstate and international trade, to print money, to declare war, of those ends, to print money, to declare war, establish army, navy, post office, postage, make laws necessary to enforce the Constitution. In order to get those, anything else besides those 10 expressed rights, it goes back to the states. So the states has all the power, and the federal government only has jurisdiction over those specific powers that is mentioned in the Constitution. So there's the specific powers of the federal government, specific powers of the state government, and then there's concurrent powers. So both the federal government and the state government have the power to tax us. So the state government can tax us, federal government can tax us tax, tax, tax everywhere you go, right? Concurrent powers. There's four different powers, right? There's implied powers, concurrent powers, implied powers, expressed powers, enumerated, right? So incidental, actually, they all got different phrases, so people actually might use different ones. But the express powers is enumerated powers. That's the specific powers. There's the implied powers or incidental powers, which is the elasticity, the welfare clause type powers, which sort of says, well, it wasn't in the United States Constitution, but how are we going to print money if we don't have a Federal Reserve? We got to have a Federal Reserve if we're going to print some money. Come on, right? So that's implied powers, even though it's not in the Constitution. In order to achieve the ends of the enumerated express powers, you can use implied powers. Then there's concurrent powers, which are side by side, right? Concurrent means side by side. So concurrent powers, they both have the exact same powers when it comes to several things. And then there's denied powers, which is meanings that you cannot infringe upon people's individual rights and freedoms. So there's concurrent powers, denied powers, implied powers, and express powers. Now the concurrent powers are: you can collect taxes, build roads, borrow money, establish courts, make and enforce laws, charter banks, corporations, spend money for the general welfare, take private property for public purposes with just compensation. You can set up courts, collect taxes, build highways, borrow money, make, enforce laws, charter banks and corporations, spend money for the betterment of the general welfare, and taking, condemning private property. Eminent domain, as long as it's for a public purpose, you can take people's property as long as you pay them a just price. So for whatever the market value is, they will take your property to put through a Keystone pipeline or a Bluegrass pipeline or Interstate 71, or some big thing that is used for a public purpose. They can also take like little alleyways to put sewage lines or electric lines, and they'll take that space up, and by eminent domain, they will buy that land that it sits on with the cost. So these are concurrent powers, both the federal government and the state government. Since the federal government has general welfare powers, that's elastic, right? So in order to protect the general welfare, we need to provide electricity for our people. In order to provide electricity, then we need to buy this land. It's not an enumerated power, and I really think that the state government would have a very strong argument by taking that power back and saying, no, that is not the federal government's, that is the state government's. But really, governments have power. They're totalitarian institutions, and the nation-state theory says that they have a monopoly on violence to achieve the ends of which they want to actually achieve. So again, the concurrent powers, powers that both the federal and the state government have, that they both have, both can collect taxes, both can tax and use as taxes for whatever reasons. There's property taxes that are being used for public education, even though that is something that was established by the United States federal system. It dictates to the states how the local people are supposed to do it. So really, the education in the local schools are being financed mostly by the local residents and by the states themselves. So, which is incredible, because if the local and the state are the ones that are paying for the education, then how come it doesn't feel like community neighborhood schools? It's Common Core, right? Common Core is being sort of jammed down our throat, which I don't know. I agree with Common Core, so that way Kentucky can rise up to the level of California and New York. But there are some sort of ridiculous things about it. Making everybody a bunch of conformists isn't a good idea either. But still, it goes back to the idea that there's more local and state financing with the local governments, and so the locals and the state should have more of a say. So I do believe in vouchers, but I'm getting really far off where I want to go with. So they can collect taxes, they can build roads. Both federal government and state government can build roads. Both of them can borrow money in order to pay for whatever services they need. They both can borrow money. They can establish courts. 95% of all the criminal cases are handled by the states themselves. So when it comes to crime, it's the state government that is regulating the crime. When it, make and enforce laws, they both can make and enforce laws, and they can make whatever laws that they want to make, right? They can just pass for the general welfare, right? For the general welfare, you can pass any law that you want to for the general welfare. For Kentucky Constitution, which basically says we have all the power, they can pass any law that they want to. They can make it a law that you must skip on the way to work. If you walk, I don't know, if you walk to, I don't know, if you yeah, they could just basically criminalize walkers who don't skip. So if you're a walker and you're going to work and you're using public sidewalks and you don't skip, they can make it a law that would make that illegal, and so then you wouldn't be able to do it. So really, your imagination, right? The sky's the limit. Whatever law you could think of that could be put into law, if you know, if you dream it, then it could be done. They could charter banks and corporations. So corporations have to get permission from the state or by the federal government in order to exist. And then once you're a corporation, then you can pretty much do whatever you want to do without any liability happening to you as an individual person. So if a corporation, you know, hurts a lot of people, then the corporation would go bankrupt, but not the person who actually formed the corporation, which is the point of a corporation, chartering banks. So the state government can charter banks, right? The federal government can charter banks. They can say, yes, you're allowed to operate. Here's a, you have a bunch of money. You can loan money out, get money, try to make money. Spend money for the general welfare, so they can tax, and then they can spend money for the general welfare. So that's for state governments too. Of course, the state. I mean, for the health and the welfare and the security and happiness of the people. Section 4 of Kentucky's Constitution says that we're guaranteed the right to our safety, peace, and happiness. And if we don't get those things, then we're allowed to have any type of, we're allowed to overthrow the government if we don't believe in, you know, if we don't believe that we're getting those things. If we don't believe that we're safe, then the Section 4 of Kentucky's Constitution says that we have a right to abolish the government. So, you know, that's revolutionary. That's absolutely incredible, and I'm glad that there are people that were thinking about this. William Justice Goebel was thinking about this in 1891. I don't know if that actually would be passed today. Today it just seems like we're not really Americans today. We're like the last free generation. Nobody's really talking about any of the things that we need to be talking about. The distribution of powers, right? Who has the power? The government, the state government, the federal government, or we the people? Well, we the people are supposed to, right? Every government is based upon our consent. Well, just because we elect just because 30% of the population is going to elect Allison Lundergan Grimes as the Democrat primary, or as for the senator, that's not the majority. That's not really the consent of the people. Also, elections is just one tiny bit of power, whereas real power comes in, to the day-to-day operations. So we only get like a blank of power, just a little, just a little, one day of power is all we get, and really that one day we give away our power when we're not working, right? It's not even a federal or state holiday. We have to work 9 to 5, and then the polls close at 6. So as soon as we get out of work at 5 o'clock, we got to rush to the polls in order to get them to get ourselves voted, or to be able to vote. So concurrent powers, we get to spend money for the general welfare. We can have eminent domain, take private property for public purposes with just compensation, set up courts, collect taxes, build highways, bridges, borrow money, make and enforce laws, charter banks, corporations, spend money for the betterment of the general welfare, taking condemning private property. So condemning private property, if there's a building that's not being taken care of, then the state can just take it, right? Which is incredible. I mean, do they sell it? I mean, sometimes you get to sell it for $1, or do they just keep it and say this is ours? It would be best, actually, if they did take some of the abandoned buildings, lots of abandoned buildings in Louisville, take those abandoned buildings and give it to the homeless people. You have about 20 abandoned buildings for every homeless person out there, which is just embarrassing, actually, for us as a nation, as a people. We let people starve on our streets because who gives a damn? We don't give a shit. It's capitalist society. Some sink, some swim. And in order for you to go up, then some people got to go down. I don't believe that. I think it's ridiculous. If you put those homeless people in the house, you wouldn't have them begging on the streets. You wouldn't have them defecating, all over the sidewalks. You would put them in a house. And then once they have their own house, they would take care of that house. So that's good for the homeless person. That's good for the building. It's good for everybody. It's good for society. But not good for the corporations, and nobody makes any money, so that's why it doesn't happen. So spending money for the betterment of general welfare, taking, condemning private property, right, taxes, borrow. Okay, so I said all that. Then there's denied powers. There's denied powers to the national government. The national government cannot violate the Bill of Rights. It cannot impose export taxes among the states. It may not use money from the Treasury without the passage and approval of an appropriations bill, and it cannot change the state boundaries. Denied powers. the Treasury thing, may not use money from the Treasury without the passage and approval of appropriations bills. So that means they actually have to pass a budget, right? You can't spend any money unless you pass a budget. Denied powers to the state government. You cannot enter into treaties with other countries. May not print money. May not tax imports or exports. May not impair obligations of contracts. May not suspend a person's rights without due process, right? So the writ of habeas corpus, you can't just trap somebody without saying why they're being trapped, or without them going through a court proceeding. You cannot stop people from entering into contracts, nor can you set up tariffs for anybody else. And I'm going to get the denied powers. One more thing coming up. Check out the next video.